Grant Halston set his glass down like he owned the table, because in his mind, he already did. "It's settled," he said, loud enough for every guest to hear. "Evelyn will make a fine banker's wife. Quiet, well-kept, easy to manage." He didn't look at her when he said it. Didn't even glance her direction, just smiled at her father and reached across the table to shake hands on a future that belonged to someone else. Evelyn's fork stopped moving. Around her, the room filled with congratulations, clinking glasses, and the kind of laughter that sounds rehearsed. Nobody asked her a single word. Not one person at that table thought to turn and say, "What do you want?" But someone noticed. Across the yard, through the open window, a ranch hand named Luke Mercer watched the whole thing. He didn't smile, he didn't raise his glass, he just looked at Evelyn, and then quietly walked away, like a man who refused to celebrate someone else's surrender. That was the moment, right there. The dinner that stole her future, and the stranger who was the only one who seemed to know it. If this story moves you, if you've ever had your voice taken away by someone who never bothered to ask, subscribe to this channel right now and follow every part of Evelyn's journey to the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The dinner had been Silas Whitmore's idea, like most things in that house. He'd called it a family celebration, which was the kind of phrase Silas used when he wanted something to sound warmer than it actually was. In practice, a Whitmore family celebration meant pressed tablecloths, polished silverware that nobody used except on occasions like this, and the particular silence that settled over the house whenever Silas had already made up his mind and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Evelyn had known something was coming for 2 weeks. She'd felt it in the way her father's mood had shifted. Not darker, exactly, but tighter. Controlled in the way a man gets when he's carrying a decision he hasn't announced yet. He'd been meeting with Grant Halston twice a week since early spring, and those meetings always ended with her father walking back through the front door, looking slightly more relieved than when he'd left. She hadn't pressed him. That had always been her mistake, believing that if she gave him space, he would eventually include her. He never did. She dressed carefully that evening, not because she was excited, but because she understood somewhere in her gut that she refused to fully acknowledge, that whatever was about to happen would be permanent. So she'd worn her mother's earrings, the small pearl ones, and told herself it was just dinner. Grant arrived 20 minutes late, which he always did. He called it making an entrance, and he said it like it was funny. He wore a suit that cost more than any of the ranch hands would see in 3 months, and he brought a bottle of wine that he handed to Silas with the practiced ease of a man who understood that gifts to the father were investments in the daughter. He kissed Evelyn on the cheek when he came in. His lips were dry and quick, the way you'd greet a business contact. "You look lovely," he said, but he was already turning toward her father. Dinner moved the way those evenings always moved. Her father talking about cattle prices and land values and the expansion he'd been planning for the eastern pasture, Grant listening and nodding and occasionally saying something polished and financial that made Silas lean forward with interest. Evelyn ate her food and answered when spoken to and felt herself grow smaller with every passing course. She was good at this, disappearing without leaving the table. Afterward, when the plates were cleared and the wine was poured a second time, Silas stood up. Just slightly, not dramatically, not a full rise, more like a man who wanted to signal that something important was about to come from him, and he needed the posture to match the weight of it. "I think it's time," he said, "to make things official." Evelyn set down her fork. The sound it made against the plate was louder than she intended. Silas smiled. Not at her, at Grant. The two of them shared a look that had clearly been rehearsed somewhere she wasn't invited, and Grant straightened in his chair with the contained pleasure of a man who'd already won and was now simply collecting. "Grant has asked for Evelyn's hand," Silas said, "and I've given him my blessing. The room, which was only the 3 of them, plus the 2 neighboring families her father had also invited, the Carvers and the Duncans, who were seated at the table like witnesses, went warm with approval." Margaret Carver made a small sound of delight. Old Roy Duncan lifted his glass before Silas had even finished speaking. Nobody looked at Evelyn, not for a full 10 seconds, and in those 10 seconds something shifted inside her. Not broke. She was too stubborn for that. But it cracked. A fine, invisible crack, the kind that doesn't announce itself right away but spreads slow and certain under pressure. Evelyn. Her father's voice, finally turning toward her, carried the tone he used when he expected compliance. Not cruel, just certain. The way you speak to someone when you've already decided the outcome. Isn't this wonderful news? She looked at him. She looked at Grant, who was watching her with a half smile that assumed she would perform happiness on cue. She stopped, swallowed. Yes, she said. It's wonderful. And the room moved forward without her. She didn't remember the rest of the toast with much clarity. She poured herself more water than she needed. She smiled when Margaret Carver touched her arm and called her a lucky girl. She stood beside Grant when her father insisted on shaking hands with him again, and she noticed that Grant put his arm around her waist with the automatic possessiveness of a man arranging furniture. She noticed because she went rigid, just slightly, just enough that someone paying close attention might have seen it. Grant didn't notice, but someone else did. The ranch hands ate separately, as they always had. It wasn't a rule anyone had written down, it was just the Whitmore way, the arrangement that had existed since before Evelyn could remember. The hired men ate in the bunkhouse kitchen or out near the equipment shed depending on the weather, and on occasion evenings like this, when the main house held company, they stayed entirely out of view. Luke Mercer had been working the Whitmore ranch for just under 8 weeks. He'd come in mid-March when Silas needed extra hands for spring calving, quiet and competent, and the kind of man who didn't make himself known through noise. He was in his mid-30s, lean in the way that comes from actual work rather than effort, with hands that showed every hard year honestly. He wasn't eavesdropping. He'd been coming around the side of the house to check on one of the mares that had been favoring her left foreleg all day. The veterinarian wasn't coming until morning, and Luke had the habit of checking things twice when something seemed off, when the dining room window framed the whole scene for him. He saw Silas stand. He saw Grant straighten. He heard the shape of the announcement, even if he missed some of the exact words, because voices carry on still evenings, and Silas Whitmore was not a quiet man. He saw Evelyn's fork stop. He stood there in the shadow of the house, not intending to watch, and then he watched anyway, the way you do when something catches something in you that you weren't expecting. He saw the whole table light up with congratulations. He saw Margaret Carver's hands flutter. He saw Grant receive his praise with the comfort of a man collecting his due. And he saw Evelyn, still, composed, her face arranged into the exact shape of what everyone in that room needed from her. And he recognized something in that stillness that had nothing to do with happiness. When Silas said something and the table laughed and Grant touched Evelyn's arm, Luke Mercer looked away. He stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, and something moved across his face that wasn't easy to name. Not pity. Not quite. Something harder than pity and more careful. He turned and went back to check on the mare. He did not go to the main house the next morning when the other hands went to receive their weekend assignments. He sent word through a younger hand named Cody that he'd already handled the water trough situation in the north pasture and would be working the fence line near the creek if anyone needed him. He didn't want to hear congratulations. That seemed important to him. He couldn't have explained it clearly to anyone, and he didn't try. The morning after the announcement, Evelyn woke before the sun. She hadn't slept well, not badly enough to call it insomnia, just that restless quality of sleep that comes when your mind is working a problem your chest hasn't finished processing. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the ranch breathe, the creak of the old house, the distant low of cattle, the sound of morning trying to start. Then she got up, put on her boots, and went to work. This was how Evelyn Whitmore had always coped with her own life. Not by sitting with things, she didn't have much patience for sitting, but by moving, by doing something her hands could manage while her mind untangled the rest. She went to the barn first, fed the horses, did it herself even though it wasn't her job, or rather, it was never supposed to be her job, which was exactly why she did it. Her father had views about what a Whitmore daughter should and shouldn't do with her mornings, and those views had never quite matched the daughter he'd actually raised. She was checking the water situation in the east paddock, clipboard in hand, when she nearly walked directly into Luke Mercer coming the other direction with a coil of fence wire over his shoulder. They both stopped. He had the look of someone who'd been working for 2 hours already. Dust on his arms, a cut on his left hand that had been wrapped in a piece of cloth that had since come half undone. His eyes went to the clipboard and then back to her face with a neutrality that wasn't coldness. Miss Whitmore, he said. A nod. Professional, careful. Mr. Mercer. She stopped too, shifted the clipboard under her arm. The fence near the creek. That you? Yesterday? Yes, ma'am. Section near the old cottonwood had 3 posts that wouldn't hold a storm. I got them before the weather turned. She looked at him more directly. She hadn't talked to him much since he'd come on in March. He was quiet in a way that didn't invite casual conversation, and she'd respected it without thinking too much about why. Nobody assigned you that, she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. No, he said. I noticed it needed doing. She looked at the wrapped hand. You need that looked at properly. I'll manage. Then, seeing something in her expression, genuinely, I've had worse from a barn cat. She almost smiled. She didn't quite. There's a kit in the equipment shed, the brown box on the second shelf. I know it, he said. Thank you. He moved to go around her, and she stepped to the side to let him pass. And that was all that happened. An exchange of perhaps 30 words, practical and brief, between a rancher's daughter and a hired hand on a Tuesday morning, except that he hadn't said congratulations. She realized it 3 steps later when she was already moving back toward the paddock. She stopped, turned it over in her mind. Every single person who had learned about the engagement in the past 16 hours, every hand, every neighbor, every person who'd crossed paths with her, had said something about it. The other hands with that awkward cheerfulness men use when they're not sure what's expected of them. Cody had actually said, "Real nice, Miss Whitmore," which was sweet in the way of something that didn't know what it was doing. Not Luke Mercer. He had looked at her like a person, asked about the fence, told her about the posts. It was such a small thing. She stood there in the open air with the morning coming up around her, and she felt the crack from last night run just slightly, silently, deeper. Grant came to the ranch 2 days later to discuss the details, which was how he talked about things that he had already decided. He and Silas sat at the kitchen table with papers and a calendar, and the particular energy of 2 men who had found each other professionally useful. Evelyn sat with them because it was expected, with a cup of coffee she didn't really want, and she listened to them plan the broad strokes of her future with the attentive quiet of someone who has learned that objecting too clearly only makes the walls close in faster. The wedding would be in October. The ranch's east pasture expansion would be financed through Grant's bank at a favorable rate, a rate, Evelyn noted, that Grant described as a gift to the family, though it was tied to terms she hadn't seen the full document for. She'd asked once, quietly, if she could read the full loan agreement, and Grant had smiled with his teeth and said, "Your father and I have it well in hand, sweetheart." Sweetheart. She had looked at the table. After Grant left, he never stayed for dinner if there wasn't an audience. She found herself standing at the kitchen window, watching his car pull down the dirt road, and she had the very clear, very specific thought, I do not like the person I become when he is in this room. Her father came and stood beside her. He's a good man, Silas said. His voice carried the conviction of someone who needed to believe it. He's a capable man, Evelyn said, which was different. Silas looked at her sideways. She felt it without turning. This is the right choice for the ranch, he said, for the family. I know you believe that. The words weren't angry. They were something worse than angry. They were tired. The specific fatigue of someone who has spent years swallowing conversations that never went anywhere. Silas didn't have an answer for that. He was a man who understood cattle and land and contracts. He understood his daughter less well, and he'd always handled that gap by moving faster and hoping she'd keep up. He cleared his throat. The Carvers are coming Friday. I need you to be present. Of course, she said. She watched his reflection in the window move away, back toward his office, back toward the papers and figures that were the only language he'd ever been fully comfortable in. She stood there a while longer. Then she put down her coffee cup, pulled on her jacket, and went back out to the ranch because the water pressure in the south irrigation line had been low all week, and nobody else was going to figure out why. She found Luke already at it. He was crouched at the junction box near the south pasture, which was not anywhere near his assigned section, with the panel open and a small flashlight in his teeth because his hands were occupied with 2 different connectors. He heard her coming and glanced up. The flashlight made his expression hard to read. The valve on the secondary intake is corroded, he said, around the flashlight, which came out muffled but still intelligible. He took it out of his mouth. The seal's been leaking slow for maybe 2 months. That's your pressure problem. She crouched down beside him to look. How did you find this? Worked backward from where the pressure was dropping. Took about 40 minutes. She studied the corroded valve. He was right. The seal was deteriorated in a way that would have been invisible from the surface, a slow bleed that would eventually have caused real damage if it had gone into summer. This would have been bad, she said. Yes, he said. Not yes, ma'am. Just yes. Like he was talking to someone who didn't need the softening. Do we have a replacement? I ordered one this morning. Should be here Thursday. He paused. I cleared it with your foreman. She looked at him. He was looking at the valve, not at her, which made it easier to look at him directly. He had a particular quality of stillness, not the stillness of a man who is hiding something, but the stillness of someone who had simply decided, somewhere back in his life, that most motion was waste. You went around Bobby to order parts? Bobby Hale was the senior foreman, a good man and slow to act on anything that wasn't directly assigned. Through Bobby, Luke corrected. He approved it. He wasn't going to move fast on it. And the part needs to be here before Saturday if you don't want to hand water the South Herd through the weekend. She was quiet for a moment. Why do you know so much about irrigation systems? She asked. It wasn't in his hiring profile. She knew because she'd been the one to review the hired hand files in March, which was a task her father had technically assigned to Bobby Hale, but which Evelyn had quietly done herself because Bobby lost papers. Something shifted in Luke's expression. Brief. I ran my own place for a while, he said. Long time ago. She waited to see if more would follow. It didn't. She didn't push. She understood instinctively the value of not pushing. Thank you, she said. For the valve. For catching it. He looked at her then. Directly. Briefly. With an evenness that had nothing in it except acknowledgement. No performance. No effort to be charming or impressive or anything other than precisely what he was. It needed doing, he said. Same words as before. She stood up. He turned back to the panel. She walked back toward the house in the late afternoon light, with the dry smell of the land around her and the sound of work continuing behind her, and she thought, for just a moment, about how many times in her life someone had looked at her the way he just had. Not like a prize, not like a problem, not like a symbol of something they wanted or needed, just like a person, like someone worth the honest answer. She couldn't come up with a long list. The crack inside her didn't deepen this time. It did something different. It went quiet and still and waited, the way fault lines do in the long pause before something begins to shift. The replacement valve arrived Thursday morning, same as Luke had said it would. Evelyn was there when the supply truck came up the drive, not because she'd planned to be, but because she'd been in the equipment shed since early morning working through the inventory records that Bobby Hale kept in a system that made sense only to Bobby Hale, which meant it made sense to no one, including Bobby Hale on bad days. She heard the truck and walked out, and Luke was already at the back of it, signing the delivery slip with the economical hand of someone who didn't waste motion even in paperwork. He glanced at her. It's the right part, he said, before she could ask. I didn't say anything. You were about to check the part number. She looked at the box. She had in fact been about to check the part number. How long to install it? She asked instead. 2 hours. Maybe less if the threads on the old fitting aren't too far gone. He picked up the box. I'd give myself 3 to be safe. She nodded. He started toward the south pasture, and she fell into step beside him without quite deciding to, and neither of them made anything of it. That was how it started, really. Not with a conversation, not with a decision, just with two people walking the same direction because the work was there and both of them understood it. She helped him that morning. She wasn't asked to, and she didn't announce that she was staying. She simply handed him tools when he needed them, held the flashlight when the angle was awkward, and when the old fitting turned out to be corroded worse than expected, and the thread stripped on the second attempt, she was the one who said, "The penetrating oil is in the red cabinet in the shed, second drawer," before he'd finished the sentence, asking if they had any. He looked at her when she came back with it. "You know this ranch," he said. "I grew up on it." "That's not the same thing. Plenty of people grow up somewhere and never learn it." She handed him the oil without answering, but she turned the observation over in her mind for the rest of the morning. The valve was in by 11:30. Luke ran the system through its cycle, crouched by the intake with his hand over the junction, And when the pressure held steady, he sat back on his heels with the contained satisfaction of someone who does not celebrate but does allow themselves to register when something works. "That'll hold," he said. "Good." Evelyn made a note on her clipboard. Then she looked at the line of fence running north from the pasture toward the ridge. "The Carvers are coming Friday. My father wants everything presentable." Luke followed her gaze. "The fence near the ridge is fine. The section by the lower creek is not." "I know. Bobby was supposed to have 2 men on it last week." "Bobby had 2 men on the equipment barn because one of the tractors threw a belt." She looked at him. "How do you know about the tractor?" "I was there when it happened." A pause. "Bobby doesn't always update the assignment board." No, Bobby didn't. Bobby ran on a system of oral communication and personal memory that functioned adequately when nothing went wrong and fell apart completely when 2 things needed doing at once. "Can the creek fence be done before Friday?" she asked. Luke considered it the way he considered most things, briefly, but like he was actually running the numbers rather than performing the act of thinking. "If I start this afternoon, I'll need Cody. Take him." She made another note. "And take the good post driver. The one Bobby hides behind the fuel tanks because he doesn't want anyone else using it." Something crossed Luke's face that might, under different circumstances, have become a smile. "I didn't know anyone else knew about that." "Bobby thinks he's subtle." She closed the clipboard. "He is not subtle." This time it did become a smile, brief and genuine, there and then gone, not performed for her benefit, just an honest reaction that he didn't bother suppressing. It changed his face in a way she hadn't expected, made him look less like a man carrying something heavy, and more like a man who simply knew the weight of what he was carrying and had made terms with it. She found herself looking away before she meant to. She walked back to the house with the clipboard under her arm and the morning drying on the land around her, and she did not let herself think too carefully about that smile. The Carver visit went fine, in the functional sense. The fence was done. The horses looked well. Roy Duncan's wife admired the flower beds that the housekeeper, Martha, maintained with dogged seasonal loyalty. Grant came with his own car and his own agenda, and he sat at her father's right hand at dinner and talked about interest rates, and Evelyn sat across from him and smiled at appropriate intervals and felt herself growing transparent. After dinner, the men went to Silas's study the way men at these gatherings always did, self-sorting, automatic, no malice intended, no awareness extended. Margaret Carver and Roy's wife set about discussing the wedding in the particular way of women who find joy in logistics, and Evelyn excused herself to check on something with the horses, because it was the only excuse available to her that anyone would accept without comment. She didn't go to the horses. She went to the paddock fence and stood in the dark with her arms folded on the top rail, looking at nothing in particular, breathing the cold spring air like it was something she'd been rationed. She heard footsteps in the gravel behind her and assumed it was Martha coming to tell her she was needed back inside. It wasn't Martha. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," Luke said from a respectful distance. "But the old gray mare is in the near stall if you actually want company that won't ask you to smile." She turned. I was there at the edge of the paddock light, carrying a bucket he'd clearly been taking somewhere before he saw her, not manufacturing a reason to come over. She should have said something. She said, "He talked about the London gold market for 40 minutes. A beat. "Was any of it relevant to anything happening here?" Luke asked. "Not a single word." He set the bucket down and came to stand a few feet away at the fence, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to signal he was leaving. "My father thinks he's a good man," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it to him. Maybe because he was there. Maybe because he had the quality of someone who wouldn't do anything unhelpful with the information, like repeat it or feel sorry for her. "Your father wants the ranch to be safe," Luke said. "That's not a wrong thing to want." "No." She looked at the dark field. "But those aren't the same thing either." He didn't answer that, which was the right choice. The wrong choice would have been to agree too quickly, to validate her in the easy way that would have felt like being managed. He just stood there and let the statement exist, and the quiet around them was not uncomfortable. "How long have you been managing the ranch operations?" he asked. Not the financials, the operations. The specific, correct word. She looked at him sideways. "Who told you I was managing operations?" "Nobody." But you know where Bobby hides the post driver, and you've been carrying a clipboard every day I've been here, and yesterday you were reading the grazing rotation logs from 2019 and arguing with yourself about something in the margins. She had been. The 2019 rotation had an error in it that had been quietly affecting their winter carrying capacity for 3 years, and nobody had caught it because nobody else read the old logs. 4 years, she said, informally. Informally, he repeated. My father believes in traditional structures. The phrase sat in the air between them, and she let it, because it was as much as she was willing to say. He nodded, not sympathetically, just acknowledging the shape of the thing. The grazing rotation, he said. What did you find in the margin? She told him. It took 11 minutes. She wasn't tracking the time, but later she could reconstruct the length of the conversation by the detail of what they covered. And in that 11 minutes, she outlined the error and its downstream effects, and the correction she'd been drafting in the back of the ledger where her father wouldn't immediately see it. Luke listened the way he always seemed to listen, which was with his full attention and without the slight restlessness of people who are waiting for a pause so they can talk. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The correction would work, he said, but if you shift the northern herd 2 weeks earlier in the fall rotation, you'd get another month of recovery time on the south pasture, and you wouldn't need to supplement feed in February. She stared at him. Where did you learn range management? She asked. He picked up his bucket. Here and there. Then he looked at her directly. You should show your father the correction. He'll ask why I was reading the 2019 logs. Tell him you were managing operations. She opened her mouth and closed it again. He nodded once, that final neutral nod that seemed to be how he ended conversations, and went back toward the barn. She stood there at the fence in the cold spring night, and for the first time in 2 weeks, she felt something that wasn't the slow, grinding weight of a future being lowered onto her. It was small and careful, and she didn't trust it yet, but it was there. The calving started on a Tuesday night at the worst possible time, which was how calving always started. The weather had been reading wrong for days, too warm in the mornings, dropping too fast in the afternoons, with a sky that couldn't decide whether to deliver rain or hold it. Evelyn had been watching it with the particular anxiety of someone who understood what an unexpected cold snap during calving season could cost, and she'd moved 2 of the younger heifers to the near barn 3 days early on instinct. Bobby Hale had looked at the sky and said, probably fine. Bobby Hale was not a weather reader. The first heifer went into labor at 11:15 at night. By midnight they had 2 in progress and 1 who was presenting badly, and Luke was already in the barn when Evelyn got there, having apparently not been to sleep yet, with his sleeves rolled to the elbows and the focused quiet of someone who has done this before. She's backward, he said without turning. He knew her footstep by now, she realized. That happened on ranches, people learning the specific sound of how you walked. How long has she been at it? 40 minutes on this one. She's tiring. He didn't say we need to turn it because that was understood. I'll need you on this end. Cody was here, but he got sick. Nerves, not illness. Cody was 19. This was his first calving season. Is he all right? He'll be fine. He's outside getting air. A pause. He'll be better at this by next year. She rolled her sleeves and came to where she was needed, and what followed was 2 hours of the hardest, most concentrated physical and mental work she'd done since the last calving season, which had also been difficult, which was the nature of the work. It did not go smoothly. The calf turned, but then the heifer panicked, and there was a period of about 12 minutes that Evelyn would not like to describe to anyone unfamiliar with ranching, because it sounded worse from the outside than it was, though it was also genuinely difficult from the inside. Luke didn't panic. She noticed this not as a surprise, but as a piece of information she was filing, the specific way he stayed level when the situation wanted him to rush, the way he talked to the animal in a low, continuous voice that wasn't quite words, the way he looked at Evelyn twice during those 12 minutes, not to check if she was managing, but to coordinate, the way you look at someone you trust to be where they're supposed to be. The calf came at 2:17 in the morning. It was alive. The heifer was exhausted but stable. Cody, who had come back inside somewhere in the second hour and quietly made himself useful in the ways he could, let out a breath so long it was almost a sound. Luke sat back against the stall wall with his arms on his knees and his head dropped briefly forward. the gesture of someone allowing themselves 30 seconds of wait before picking it back up. His shirt was ruined. There was mud on his jaw from somewhere. He looked exactly like what he was, which was a man who had just done 2 hard hours of necessary work in the middle of the night and was not pretending otherwise. Evelyn sat on the other side of the stall with her back against the wood and her legs stretched out in front of her, and she was not pretending otherwise either. "Good call on moving them early," he said, to the middle space between them. "Bobby thought it was fine." Bobby thought wrong. Bobby usually thinks fine. She heard the breath that wasn't quite a laugh. She was too tired to perform not smiling, so she didn't. They sat like that for a little while, not talking, not needing to, with the heifer settling behind them, and Cody making fresh water available with the earnest helpfulness of a young man who wanted badly to contribute. Outside the barn, the wind had picked up, which meant the weather had finally decided what it was going to do. Cold. She'd been right to move them early. "You should sleep," Luke said eventually. "So should you." "I'll stay another hour, check on the third one." She thought about saying she'd stay too. She thought about it practically rather than sentimentally. One of the 2 remaining heifers was an older cow who'd calved before and would likely manage, but the other was a first-timer who'd been borderline anxious all week and bore watching. "I'll take the first-timer's stall," she said. "You take the older one." A pause. She felt him recalibrating, the small internal adjustment of someone who'd been planning to do both himself. "You need sleep too." "I'll sleep in the stall if nothing happens. I've done it before." He looked at her then. In the low barn light, his face was tired and honest, and there was something in the way he looked at her that wasn't pity or doubt or approval-seeking. It was something more like recognition, the kind you extend to someone who has proven they are who they said they are. "All right," he said. They separated to their respective stalls, and Evelyn sat with her back against the worn wood with the first-timer breathing warm and heavy nearby, and she listened to the storm arrive outside. The first hard rain of spring drumming on the barn roof, filling the gutters, doing what weather does. And she felt, against all reasonable expectation, not trapped, not pressed down by the weight of October and Grant Halston and the loan documents she hadn't been allowed to read. She felt exactly where she was. In a barn in the rain in the middle of the night, doing work that mattered. She fell asleep sitting up and didn't wake until the first-timer's calf arrived at 4:42 in the morning, uncomplicated and loud, and when she stood up and looked over the stall partition, Luke was already there in the aisle with a fresh towel, having apparently known exactly when to come back, and he handed it over the partition without comment. She took it. "The older one?" she asked. "Fine. Easy." He looked at the new calf, noisy and indignant. "This one's got opinions." So did the mother. She worked the towel over the calf's back, all week. "Runs in the family." She looked up at him quickly. He was looking at the calf, not her, and there was nothing in his expression except mild attention to the animal. But the words sat in the air for a moment longer than they needed to, and she felt them land somewhere they weren't entirely aimed and didn't entirely miss. She went back to the calf and said nothing, and that was the right choice. And she knew it was the right choice, and she made it deliberately. 3 days after the calving, Grant came to the ranch unannounced. He did this occasionally, showed up between scheduled visits with the energy of a man who wanted to catch something, though he would have said he was simply keeping connected. He came in the late afternoon, when Evelyn was in the middle of recalculating the winter hay storage estimates, and he found her at the kitchen table with her ledgers and her calculator and 3 cups of cold coffee that she'd forgotten to drink. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table with the specific expression of someone encountering a scene they had not expected and are not sure how to arrange. "You're doing accounts?" he said. "Projections," she said, "for fall inventory." "Shouldn't Bobby—" Bobby's estimates have been running about 12% high for 3 years. She didn't say it with heat, just with the flatness of someone stating the temperature outside. "It's cost us 2 supplemental feed orders. I'm correcting the baseline." Grant came into the kitchen and put his hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture that was probably intended to be affectionate but had the quality of someone reassuring a nervous horse. He looked at the numbers on the table with the careful blankness of a man whose expertise was in finance, but not the kind that involved hay. "After October," he said, "you won't need to worry about this kind of thing." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" she asked. He smiled, smoothly, the way he handled most things he didn't want to examine directly. It means you'll have more support, a manager, someone to handle the operational details. I handle the operational details now. Evelyn, not impatient, worse than impatient, patient, the patient tone of someone who believes they are being kind. You've been managing things informally, and you've done wonderfully, but once we're married, there'll be no reason for you to... To what? The kitchen's very quiet. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had walked into a room and found the floor slightly different than expected. He recovered quickly. Grant always recovered quickly. It was one of the things that made him good at his professional life. To take on so much, he finished. I just mean, you could rest more. Enjoy things. She looked at the ledger in front of her. She looked at 3 years of correctable error that nobody else had caught because nobody else had been paying attention. She looked at the hay projections and the grazing rotation notes, and the valve replacement record she'd started keeping because someone had to. And she thought about what it meant for a person to be told that the thing they were best at, the thing they had been doing carefully and without credit for 4 years, was a burden she could be relieved of. I don't want to rest more, she said. Quiet, even. I want to run this ranch. Grant looked at her for a moment. Then he said, You're tired. We can talk about this when you've had some sleep. He went to find Silas, and she sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the ledger. And she did not slam anything or cry or say anything else, because none of those things would have changed what he'd just shown her about himself. And she already knew what she now knew, and there was no unknowing it. She told Luke about it 2 days later. Not deliberately. Not as a thing she sat down to share. They were in the north pasture working through a section of fence that had been flagged for weeks and never addressed, a longer stretch than either of them had initially thought, requiring more restringing than Luke had materials for and more time than Bobby Hale's schedule had ever allotted. They'd been out there 3 hours already and had covered maybe 60% of it, and they were working in the comfortable rhythm of people who have learned how to share physical labor without stepping on each other when she said, in the middle of tying off a wire, he wants to hire a manager for the ranch after October. Luke didn't stop working. For operations? For everything. The accounts, the rotation, the hiring decisions. She pulled the wire taut. Everything I do. He secured his end before he said anything. Then, what did you tell him? That I wanted to run the ranch. What did he say? That I was tired. The wire stretched between the 2 posts and held. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Are you? Luke asked. Not the way you ask someone you're worried about. The way you ask someone you think deserves to be asked directly. No, she said. No, he agreed. She looked at him across the fence line. He was already reaching for the next section, methodical and steady, and he didn't look back at her with anything that suggested she needed comfort or confirmation. He'd heard it, registered it, agreed with it, and moved on to the next post, which was, she realized, exactly what she needed someone to do. Not to make it bigger, not to make it smaller, just to receive it like a fact and keep moving. She kept moving too. They finished the fence line as the light was going orange, and it wasn't perfect work. There was one section near the old water gap that would need revisiting, and one post that hadn't gone in quite straight enough to fully satisfy either of them. But it was done, and it would hold, and the cattle that had been working at that corner for 2 months looking for a weak point would find none. On the walk back, Luke said, without preamble, I ran a spread in Wyoming, about 700 acres. Nothing like this, but cattle, horses, a water rights situation that nearly killed me before the weather did. He paused. I understand what you're looking at. When someone looks at what you've built and tells you it's too much for you. She looked at him. He was looking at the ground ahead of them. What happened to the spread? She asked. He was quiet for 3 or 4 steps. Bad year, he said. Then another one. I made decisions I should have made differently, and 1 or 2 that I couldn't have known were wrong when I made them, and by the time I'd sorted out which was which, there wasn't much left to sort. A beat. That's how it goes sometimes. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be. He said it simply, without shutting her out. It taught me what I know. That's worth something. She thought about that. She thought about the way he'd been here 8 weeks and had quietly fixed 3 things nobody had asked him to fix, and caught one problem that would have cost them significantly, and done it all without announcing himself, without asking for recognition, without positioning it as a favor owed. "It's worth a lot," she said. "What you know?" He glanced at her sideways, brief and neutral. "So is what you know," he said. They walked back to the ranch in the last of the evening light, not too close, not performing distance either, two people carrying their separate weights in a compatible silence, while the sky above the ridge went deep gold and then dark, and the spring wind turned cooler, and the sounds of the ranch settling into night came up around them from every direction. She thought about October. She thought about ledgers and corrected baselines, and a calf born at 4:42 in the morning while rain drummed on a barn roof. She thought about what it meant to be seen clearly by another person, and how rare that was, and how you didn't always notice it was rare until you'd had a stretch of days where it kept happening. She didn't say any of this out loud, but she walked back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and opened her ledger to the fall projections, and she wrote in the margins, in her careful, economical hand, the adjustments Luke had suggested for the northern herd rotation. She worked them through, checked them, rechecked them, and when she was satisfied they were right, she wrote them clean into the main column and dated the entry. She did not think about whether her father would ask about them. She did not think about what Grant would say. She just did the work, because it was her work, and she had always known it. Silas Whitmore was not a man who moved slowly when he had decided something needed doing. That was both his greatest strength and the specific quality that had, over the course of Evelyn's life, caused her the most damage. He could read a pasture, read a market, read the sky before a storm, but he had never learned to read the interior weather of his own daughter, and he had compensated for that blindness with motion. Keep moving. Make the next decision, close the next deal. If you stayed ahead of the doubt couldn't catch you. By the second week of May, Silas had decided that Luke Mercer was a problem. He hadn't said it in those words. Silas rarely said things in direct words when he could arrange them in the shape of a task instead. He called Luke into the main office on a Thursday morning, which was unusual in itself. The ranch hands dealt with Bobby Hale, not with Silas directly, and a summons to the main office meant either something had gone badly wrong or someone was being managed. Luke came in with his hat in his hands, which was the appropriate gesture and which he made without the self-consciousness of someone performing deference. He sat where Silas indicated. He waited. Silas talked about the ranch for a while, the upcoming fence expansion on the west boundary, the seasonal hire schedule, the condition of the tractor that had thrown the belt in April. He talked with the ease of a man who is comfortable in his own space and who understands that space as an instrument of power, which the office was. The desk was large. The window behind it framed the land. Silas Whitmore sat in front of that window, and the land was behind him like a credential. Luke listened. He did not fill silences. "You've been doing good work," Silas said finally, with the tone of a man who is about to make the word, but do a lot of labor. "Thank you, sir. I've heard from Bobby that you've been active, beyond your assigned section." Luke looked at him steadily. There were things that needed doing. There are always things that need doing on a ranch. Silas leaned back. "That's not what I'm talking about." A pause. The window light shifted. "I'm talking," Silas said, more carefully, "about my daughter's time." The room was very quiet after that. Luke held Silas's gaze without aggression and without retreat. "Miss Whitmore and I have worked together on several operational problems. The irrigation valve, the calving rotation, the north fence. She initiated most of it." "I know she did." Silas picked up a pen he didn't need and turned it in his fingers. "Evelyn has always involved herself in operations. That's not the issue. The issue is—" He stopped. Tried a different angle. "She's engaged, Mercer. October is coming fast. I don't want her distracted from what's important." "I understand," Luke said. "Do you?" "Yes, sir." Silas looked at him for a long moment. The look of a man trying to find the loose thread in a knot and not quite locating it. "I'm going to extend your contract through summer," Silas said. "Double the seasonal rate. I'll need someone experienced for the west expansion." He paused. "But I need that person focused on the west expansion, not on other things." It was a generous offer with a clear instruction buried in the middle of it, and both of them understood exactly what the instruction was. Luke was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate the offer," he said. "I'll think on it." Silas nodded like it was settled. It was not, and they both knew it, but the meeting was over, and Luke stood and put his hat back on and walked out into the May morning, and Silas turned to his window and looked at his land and felt the vague, unpleasant sensation of a man who has placed a bet he's not certain about. Luke didn't tell Evelyn about the meeting directly. He told her the way he told her most things, sideways, in the middle of something else. They were in the supply shed 2 days later, going through the post inventory for the West expansion, when he said, "Your father offered me a summer contract." She looked up from the count sheet. "Good wage," he added. "West boundary work. Are you taking it?" He picked up one of the posts and checked its weight and grain with the automatic assessment of someone who has handled enough lumber to read it by feel. "I'm considering it." "What's making you consider it?" she asked. She knew it wasn't the wage. He didn't work like a man whose primary relationship with the job was the money in it. He set the post back down. "Your father has views," he said, "about how the summer should go." She understood immediately. She was quiet for a moment while she added a row to the count sheet, and then stopped adding and set down the pencil. "He spoke to you." "He was straightforward about it." "What did he say?" Luke looked at her with the directness she'd come to expect from him, the refusal to dress things up or soften them into something easier. "He said October is coming. He said he doesn't want you distracted." She felt the familiar heat of it move through her. Not quite anger, though anger was part of it. Something older and more worn than anger. The specific frustration of a person who has spent years being managed by someone who loves them and cannot see them clearly. "I'm not distracted," she said. "I know that. I'm the least distracted person on this ranch." "I know that too." She picked up her pencil, put it back down. "What are you going to do?" He leaned against the shed wall and crossed his arms and looked at the inventory stacked around them. The posts, the wire spools, the hardware sorted into labeled bins that had been a disorganized mess when he arrived, and that Evelyn had reorganized over 3 afternoons in February before he'd even come on staff. "I'm going to take the contract," he said, "because the West expansion needs doing and I can do it well." He paused. "And because leaving wouldn't be the right thing, and I try not to do things because they're easier." She looked at him. "Leaving would be easier?" she asked, and she meant it as a clarifying question, and it came out slightly more direct than she intended, and she didn't walk it back. He met her eyes. "Some situations," he said carefully, "are less complicated from a distance." He pushed off the wall. "That doesn't make leaving right. It just makes it easier. Those aren't the same thing." He picked up the count sheet and walked to the next row of inventory, and she stood there for a moment in the particular stillness of someone who has just been told something significant in language that required them to do the work of understanding it. She picked up her pencil and followed. June arrived with heat. The West expansion moved fast. Luke worked it the way he worked everything, which was steadily and without announcement, and the fence line moved along the boundary at a rate that impressed Bobby Hale enough that he mentioned it to Silas, who made a note and said nothing. Cody and 2 other seasonal hands worked alongside Luke, and Cody in particular had attached himself to Luke with the earnest loyalty of a young man who has found someone worth learning from, which Luke bore with patience and occasionally redirected when it tipped into hero worship. "Stop watching how I hold the driver," Luke told him one afternoon, "and watch the post. The post will tell you if you've got it right. I won't always be here to tell you." Cody had looked slightly stung. Then he'd turned and watched the post, and he'd found the thing Luke meant, and he'd adjusted, and the next one went in better, and he understood what had just happened, that he'd been taught something that would stay with him past the summer, past this ranch, past Luke Mercer himself. Evelyn saw that exchange from 20 yards away, from where she was checking the water situation on the north expansion line, and she filed it in the growing mental record she was keeping of this man without quite admitting to herself that she was keeping it. She was busy through June in ways that left her genuinely tired rather than performatively occupied. The grazing rotation correction she'd made to the ledger had to be communicated to Bobby Hale in a way that Bobby could implement without feeling undermined, which required more diplomacy than the correction itself. The loan documents. Grant's bank had sent in late May. The ones she still hadn't been allowed to formally review were sitting in her father's desk drawer, and she knew they were there because she'd seen the envelope and recognized the bank letterhead, and the fact that they were in his drawer rather than on his desk meant he'd moved them when he didn't want her to notice them. She noticed everything. That had always been both her gift and her specific loneliness. She brought it up with her father on a Tuesday evening, chosen carefully, after dinner, when he was settled, before he'd moved to his desk for the night reading. "I want to see the loan agreement," she said. "The full document." Silas looked up from his coffee. "Grant and I have it handled," he said. "The same words as before, different mouth. I understand that. I'd still like to read it. Evelyn, I'm going to be part of this family's financial situation for the rest of my life," she said. "I'm asking to read the document that establishes what that situation is." Silas was quiet for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the evening sounds of the ranch continued without awareness of what was happening in the sitting room. "There are terms in it," he said finally, "that are contingent." "Contingent on what?" He looked at his coffee. "On the marriage," she said. Not a question, a sentence completing itself. He looked up. "The favorable rate," she said. Her voice was steady in the way of something that has been compressed into a very small space. "It's contingent on the marriage going forward." "It's a business arrangement," he said. "That's how these things work. That's how they've always—" "You used my future as collateral," she said. The word landed between them like something dropped. Silas's jaw tightened. "That is not how I would characterize. How would you characterize it?" He didn't answer. She stood up. She wasn't shaking, which surprised her. She felt very clear, the way you sometimes feel in emergencies. No fog, no hesitation, just the clean, bright fact of what's in front of you. "I'm going to read the document," she said. "Tonight or tomorrow. Either you give it to me or I'll ask Grant for a copy myself. And if he refuses, I'll have a clearer picture of what both of you think of me." She paused. "I'd rather you give it to me." She went to her room. 40 minutes later, her father slid the envelope under her door. She sat on her bed with the lamp on and read every page of it twice. And when she was done, she sat with it in her lap and looked at the wall and felt something inside her calcify into a shape she didn't yet have a name for, but would, in time, come to recognize as the beginning of certainty. She didn't tell Luke about the loan document for a week. Not because she was hiding it, but because she was still working out what it meant for her, and she didn't process things well out loud when they were still raw. She needed to turn something over internally until it cooled enough to hold in her hands before she could look at it clearly with another person. When she told him, they were out at the water gap section of the north fence, the one they'd identified in spring as needing revisiting, and she'd come to check on it and found him already there, which was no longer surprising to her. His presence in the places where work needed doing had stopped feeling coincidental weeks ago. She told him the key terms flatly. The favorable rate, the contingency. The marriage as the mechanism by which her father's expansion loan remained viable. Luke listened and didn't say anything right away. He continued working the section, and she stood near him, and the silence stretched long enough that she knew he was actually thinking and not just waiting for the silence to become his turn to speak. "How much is the loan?" he asked. She told him. He set down his pliers. A significant amount, and they both understood what it meant for a ranch that was doing well enough but was not liquid in the way that number required. "If the marriage doesn't go forward," he said, "the rate converts to standard commercial." She'd done the arithmetic 3 times. The difference over 10 years is substantial. How substantial? She told him that number too. He picked up his pliers, worked the wire. She watched his hands do the automatic practice thing while he thought through something larger. "That's your father's decision," he said finally. "The loan. That's a decision he made. It's not yours to carry. It will be mine to live with." "That's different." He looked at her directly. "You're not responsible for a hole someone else dug, even if they're someone you love." She looked at the fence. He thought he was protecting the ranch. "I know." He didn't say that doesn't make it right, but she heard it anyway, in the space around the words he did say. "What would you do?" she asked. She hadn't meant to ask it. It came out before she could decide whether to. He was quiet for long enough that she started to think he wasn't going to answer. "I'd decide what I could live with," he said, "and then I'd live with it, whatever the cost." She nodded slowly. The wire held between the posts, taut and clean. "That's not an easy answer," she said. "No," he said, "it's not." The test came in July, and it came from Silas, though it wore the costume of opportunity. He asked Luke to oversee a separate grazing operation on the Whitmore's smaller satellite property, 30 miles away, a week-long job, good pay. The kind of assignment that would remove Luke from the main ranch during a stretch when Evelyn and her father were due to have a series of meetings with Grant about wedding arrangements. Luke took the assignment without complaint. He was gone Monday through Friday. Evelyn sat through 3 meetings with Grant and her father and smiled at appropriate intervals, and asked one question about the ceremony timeline that Grant answered by speaking to Silas. And she wrote down the answers in her notebook and said nothing about the loan, and nothing about what she had decided, and nothing about Luke Mercer. She thought about her mother sometimes during those meetings. Her mother had died when Evelyn was 11. Not dramatically, just illness, just the way people die when the story doesn't need a villain. She'd been a quiet woman, competent in the domestic architecture of the house, the way Evelyn was competent in the operational architecture of the ranch. She had not, as far as Evelyn could remember, ever said a single thing directly against Silas's decisions. She wondered sometimes whether her mother had been happy, or whether she'd made the same calculation Evelyn was now facing and chosen the version with less visible cost. She didn't want to make that choice. She'd realized it somewhere between the first and second reading of the loan document. She didn't want to become the woman who chose the version with less visible cost and spent the rest of her life paying the invisible kind. Luke came back Friday evening, dust-covered and tired, and he came to find her at the paddock fence where she sometimes went when the house was too full of the specific pressure of other people's expectations. "How was the satellite property?" she asked. "The water situation was worse than Silas knew. I fixed it." He came to stand at the fence. "How were the meetings?" "Grant has chosen a photographer he describes as important. For a ranch wedding." "For a ranch wedding?" She looked at the field. "The ceremony will be at the Whitmore property, per my father's wishes. The reception will be in town, at a venue Grant's family uses. It seats 240 people. Luca was quiet. "I don't know 240 people," she said. "No," he said. "Grant knows them. They're his people." She gripped the fence rail. "I'll be the thing at the center of a party that has nothing to do with me." She hadn't said that out loud to anyone. The words had a different texture spoken than they'd had sitting in her chest for weeks. Luke turned to look at her. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Same directness he always used, no flinching, no softening. She looked back at him. "I don't know yet," she said, which was true, but not entirely true. There was something forming in her, slow and heavy and irreversible, the way a decision is when it's been made at a level below the conscious and is working its way up. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned back to the field. "Whatever you decide," he said, "make sure it's yours." A pause. "Not your father's version of safe. Not Grant's version of sensible. Yours." She stood there with the evening light on the land and his words in the air and something in her chest that was pressing upward with increasing insistence. She wanted to say something, several things. None of them were things she was ready to say yet, and she knew that, and she held them. "Okay," she said. He nodded. He pushed off the fence and started back toward the bunkhouse, and she watched him go with the particular awareness of someone who is paying close attention to something they can't yet name, but know they will not forget. Grant's mistake, the one that broke the last load-bearing wall, happened on a Saturday in late July. He'd come for the weekend, which he was doing more frequently now as October approached, and which Evelyn endured with the practiced composure of someone who has decided to keep their own counsel. He was in a good mood, which was sometimes worse than his difficult moods, because his good moods had a celebratory quality that had nothing to do with her. He found her in the barn that morning, where she'd been checking on one of the horses who'd been slightly off his feed for 2 days. Grant came in already talking, the way he sometimes did, launching the conversation before he'd established whether she was ready for it. "I had an interesting conversation with your foreman this morning," he said. She kept her attention on the horse. "Bobby?" "He was telling me about the calving in March. Apparently one of your hands has been doing all sorts of things beyond his job description." He said it lightly, with the tone of someone delivering amusing information. "Managing systems, ordering parts, leading fence crews. Your father's paying for a ranch hand and getting a foreman." She heard what was underneath the lightness. "Luke Mercer is good at his job." "Luke Mercer," Grant said, finding the name suddenly concrete, "is apparently quite present." She turned. He was watching her with a smile that didn't quite reach the practiced pleasantry of his usual expression. This was a different smile. sharper. The smile of a man who has assembled information he considers useful. He's a ranch hand, she said. He does ranch work. Bobby says you and he have spent considerable time together. Working, he was careful to say. The careful was positioned like a hook. I'm sure that's exactly right. She looked at Grant directly. What is it you're saying? He came a step closer. The smile settled into something more controlled. I'm saying that after October, I'd prefer a cleaner staff situation. Some of these long-term seasonal hires can get attached to how things have been done. It makes transitions harder. You're talking about firing him, she said. I'm talking about a natural end to a seasonal contract. His contract runs through the West expansion. That's October. Yes, Grant said. October. He let the word land in all its implication. Convenient timing. She stood in the barn with the horse breathing quietly beside her and Grant Halston standing in the door, and she felt very clearly what was happening. He was not managing a staff situation. He was managing her through a staff situation, using a person she respected as the instrument of the management. And she understood in that moment something she'd known in parts for weeks but had not yet assembled entirely. Grant Halston would spend the rest of her life doing this, finding the thing she valued and holding it at an angle that said, "Stay where I put you, or this changes." "I'll take it under consideration," she said. Her voice was very level. He nodded like that was the appropriate response, which it was, but not for the reason he thought. He went back to the house, and she stood in the barn, and the horse pushed his nose against her arm with the indiscriminate comfort of animals who don't know what's wrong but can tell something is. She stood there for a long time. She was thinking about October. She was thinking about loan documents and the number she'd calculated 3 times, and what it would cost her father if the rate converted. She was thinking about her mother's quietness, and the 2019 grazing logs, and a calf born at 4 a.m. in the rain. She was thinking about what Luke had said at the fence. Make sure it's yours. She was thinking about what she could live with, and what she couldn't, and by the time she walked out of that barn into the bright July morning, she knew. Not as a feeling, she'd had the feeling for weeks. As a fact. Settled, weighted, and completely, irrevocably hers. She knew what she was going to do at the engagement celebration in August. She knew what it would cost. She walked back toward the house with the sun on her face and her hands steady at her sides, and she did not let herself doubt what she knew, because doubt had never once improved what she already understood to be true. She didn't tell Luke. She wanted to. More than once in the 2 weeks that followed, she came close. At the water gap, during an evening inventory. Once, when they were both staying late over the feed calculation, and the bunkhouse was quiet, and the house was dark, and it was just the two of them, and a lamp, and the accumulated weight of a summer spent learning each other through work. She didn't tell him because she understood, somewhere careful in herself, that what she was going to do had to be entirely her own decision, with no part of it leaning on him. If she did it because of him, it would be one kind of thing. If she did it because she finally, completely, refused to give away the rest of her life, that was another kind of thing entirely. She needed it to be the second kind. So she worked through August with the particular focus of someone who has made a large decision and is now simply waiting for the moment to arrive. She did her work. She sat through 2 more meetings with Grant. She helped her father with the arrangements for the engagement celebration, the guest list, the food, the particular social choreography of an event designed to make a business arrangement look like joy. She did all of it with the calm of someone who knows something no one else in the room knows yet. Luke watched her in those weeks the way he watched most things, quietly, without announcing that he was watching. He didn't ask. She saw him register the change in her, the new settled quality that sat differently than the compressed composure he'd observed in spring. He didn't ask, because he had the self-discipline not to, and because he understood, she thought, that she would tell him what she needed to tell him when she was ready. The night before the engagement celebration, she went to the paddock fence one last time. He was there. She wasn't surprised. They stood in the dark with the sounds of the ranch around them and the August sky overhead, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. "Tomorrow," she said finally. "Tomorrow," he said. She looked at the field. "Whatever happens," she said, "I want you to know that this summer—" She stopped. Started again. "The work we did, the fence, the valve, the calving, All of it. She paused. It mattered to me. He turned to look at her. In the dark, his face was quiet and open in the way it only was when he wasn't being careful with it. It mattered to me too, he said. She nodded. She held that. Stay through tomorrow, she said. Please. He looked at her for a long moment. I wasn't going anywhere, he said. She turned back to the field. The night was warm and the stars were clear and the ranch lay quiet around them in all its complicated, beloved, contested reality, and she stood there with the decision inside her like something finally, fully solid, no longer forming, no longer pressed and small, just there. Hers. Tomorrow, she was going to walk into that party and she was going to change everything. She was ready. The morning of the engagement celebration, Evelyn woke at 5 and lay in the dark for exactly 3 minutes before she got up. She didn't do it out of anxiety, or not only that. She did it because lying still had never been something her body was good at when her mind was already moving, and her mind had been moving since before she opened her eyes. She dressed in her work clothes first, the habit of years, and went out to the barn before the house stirred, before Martha started coffee, before the day had taken its official shape. The horse who'd been off his feed in July was fully recovered now. He pushed against her hand when she opened his stall, wanting the scratch behind his ear that she'd given him every morning since he was young. She gave it to him and stood in the quiet of the barn with the smell of hay and horses around her, and she thought, not about the party, not about Grant, not about the specific words she was going to say, but about this particular smell, this particular quiet. The way morning on a ranch has its own texture, different from every other time of day, like the land is still deciding what it's going to be. She'd grown up inside this smell. She had no memory of a morning that didn't begin with it. She was not going to lose it. She fed the horses and checked the water lines and walked the perimeter of the near pasture in the early light. Not because anything needed checking, but because she needed to move through the land one more time before the day became what it was going to become. She needed to remember why. By the time she came back to the house, Martha was in the kitchen, and the coffee was on, and Silas was already at his desk with the door open, which was how he spent mornings when something had him unsettled. He heard her boots on the porch and called her name. She stood in the doorway of his office. He was looking at the ledger she'd updated in the spring, the one with her grazing rotation corrections written in the margins. He'd apparently found it, or finally looked at it properly, because he had the reading glasses on that he only used when he was going through something carefully. He looked up. These numbers, he said. He pointed to the margin. Bobby said you redid the fall projections. I corrected the baseline, she said. The 2019 rotation had an error that was compounding. I found it in February. He looked back at the ledger. He was quiet for a long moment. This changes the supplemental feed order for next winter, he said. Reduces it by about 18%. The northern herd shift accounts for the rest. Another silence. He took his glasses off and set them on the desk and looked at the page without them, which was how he looked at things when he was seeing them differently than he had before. You should have shown me this when you found it, he said. I tried to, she said. Twice. You were in meetings with Grant. He didn't respond to that. She watched him absorb it. The specific discomfort of a man who has just discovered that a thing he thought was being handled a certain way has in fact been handled much better, and not by himself. Tonight is important, he said finally. He meant the party. I know, she said. He looked at her with the careful expression of a man who wants to ask something and isn't sure of the ground. Are you all right? He asked. It was the first time in months he had asked her that. Possibly the first time in longer than that. The question landed differently than she expected. Not unwelcome, just late. The way rain is welcome and late at the same time after a long dry stretch. I'm fine, she said. I'll be ready by 6. She went to get her coffee. Grant arrived at 4:30 with his family. His mother, a compact, expensively maintained woman named Patricia, who called everyone darling with the precision of someone using it as a tool, and his younger brother Davis, who shook hands too firmly and drank too early and filled rooms with a volume that wasn't quite confidence. They brought 2 of Grant's colleagues from the bank, men whose names Evelyn immediately lost, and the Carvers and the Duncans came at 5. and by 5:30 the Whitmore property had been transformed by caterers and rented furniture into the kind of occasion that looked nothing like itself. Evelyn stood in front of her mirror at 5:45 in the dress her father had said was appropriate, blue, simple, nothing she'd chosen. And she looked at herself for a long time. She looked like someone's idea of what she should be. She thought about the ledger, the corrected margins, the 18% reduction in supplemental feed costs that nobody had thanked her for because nobody had known to. She thought about the valve seal and the calving night and the fence line and the specific quality of being seen clearly by another person, and she thought about what she was about to do. She put on her mother's pearl earrings. Then she went downstairs. The party was in full effect by the time she came down. 112 people, smaller than Grant's preferred 240, but as many as the Whitmore property could hold gracefully. And the noise of them filled every room and spilled onto the wide porch and out into the evening air. Silas was in the center of it, hosting with the ease of a man who understood social occasions as a form of leverage. Grant was doing the same thing on a smaller scale, moving through the room with his practiced warmth, touching shoulders, laughing at the right moments, working the event like a professional. Patricia Halston found Evelyn immediately. "There she is," she said, and took Evelyn's arm in a way that was physically gentle and directionally firm. "You look lovely. Come and meet the Warfields. They have property in the county. You'll be neighbors in a sense after October." She said after October the way some people say after the surgery, as if it marked the beginning of the life that actually counted. Evelyn moved through the introductions. She was polite. She was warm enough to read as genuine. She asked questions and remembered the answers and laughed when laughter was expected. And she was doing it all on one layer of herself, while the other layer stayed very still and very clear, watching the clock on the mantel move. She saw Luke once, early in the evening. He was not a guest. He'd have had no reason to be inside. But she caught a glimpse of him through the open porch door, standing near the equipment shed at the edge of the light with Cody and two other hands, the ranch continuing its life at a respectful remove from the occasion being held in its front rooms. He wasn't looking toward the house. I was talking to Cody about something, and the ease of him, the simple unhurried weight of his presence, was as steady from 30 yards as it had been all summer at 3 feet. She looked away before he could notice. She got through the dinner. She sat between Patricia and Margaret Carver, and the conversation moved around her in waves, the wedding, the plans, the county, the bank. And she ate her food and said the right things, and checked the mantel clock 4 times between the soup and the dessert. Grant caught her eye across the table twice. The first time he smiled with the territorial satisfaction of a man surveying something that belongs to him. The second time he raised his glass slightly, a small private gesture that was meant to be intimate and landed as proprietary, and she held his gaze for a moment and then looked at her plate, and something in her chest went very quiet and very final. The toast was scheduled for 8:30. Silas had planned it with the methodical care he brought to business presentations. The right moment in the evening, when people were well fed and well lubricated but not yet restless. He'd asked Grant to say a few words first, which Grant was obviously prepared for, and then Silas would speak, and then there would be champagne, and then, as Evelyn understood the plan, the room would applaud and the engagement would be formally and publicly sealed, the kind of sealing that made backing out of something require enormous and visible effort. That was, she understood, the point. She stood near the fireplace at 8:25 with a glass of sparkling water she hadn't drunk, watching the room settle. The caterers had quietly removed the dessert plates. People were arranging themselves with the unconscious choreography of an audience preparing for a performance. Grant materialized at her side. He put his hand at the small of her back. The automatic gesture. The claim without asking. "Ready?" he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. She meant something entirely different by it, and she was aware of that, and it required exactly no effort to hold. Silas moved to the center of the room. The voices dropped, the way they do when a man with weight in a room indicates he's about to speak. "Thank you all for being here," he began, in the measured voice of a man who has planned his words. "The Whitmore Ranch has stood on this land for 4 generations. That kind of legacy doesn't sustain itself. It takes vision, and it takes partnership." He paused in the way of someone leading toward something. "I'm proud tonight to formalize a partnership that I believe will take this family into a strong and prosperous future." Applause. light, anticipatory. Grant moved forward from her side. He did it naturally, the practiced movement of a man stepping into a spotlight he'd been expecting. He turned to Evelyn with his best smile, the wide one, the one that read as warm from across a room, and he extended his hand. "Evelyn," he said for the room, "come stand with me." She looked at his hand. She took one step forward, then she stopped. The room was very warm and very quiet in the way of 200 people who are all breathing, but none of them have spoken in 4 seconds. Grant's smile held. His hand stayed out. "Evelyn," her father said, softer. The private register slipping through. She looked at her father, at the man who had loved her imperfectly and managed her carefully and moved her future like a piece on a board without once, in all of it, asking what she wanted from her own life. She looked at him, and she felt the full weight of loving someone who could not see you clearly, and she did not look away from it. Then she looked at the room. 112 people. Grant's colleagues, the Carvers, the Duncans. Patricia Halston with her reading glasses chain and her precise use of the word darling. 240 attendees in her future at a venue she'd never visited. She thought about what Luke had said. Make sure it's yours. She reached into herself for doubt and found none. That was how she knew. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was clear. Not loud. The room was so quiet she didn't need loud. It carried to every corner of it without effort. "I can't do this." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. She felt it against her skin. Grant's hand came down. His smile didn't disappear exactly. It suspended, like a machine that has received a command it doesn't recognize and is waiting for the system to correct. "Evelyn," his voice was very controlled. I'm not going to marry you, Grant." She said it cleanly, without heat. There was no anger in it. Anger would have made it smaller. "I should have said that months ago. I'm sorry that I didn't, and I'm sorry that you're hearing it here, but the answer is no." She turned to her father. Silas Whitmore looked like a man who has been standing on ground he trusted and felt it move under him. His face had gone through several things in rapid succession: shock, anger, something that might have been fear, and had landed somewhere that was older than any of those. He looked in that moment simply old, and very much like a man who has just heard something true that he wasn't ready for. "Evelyn," he said. "Not tonight," she said gently. She meant it gently. "We'll talk tomorrow. I promise." She put her water glass on the mantel. She walked through the room. People moved without quite knowing they were moving, the unconscious parting that happens when someone walks with absolute conviction. Margaret Carver made a small sound. Patricia Halston said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. She went out the front door and down the porch steps and into the August night, and she kept walking until the lights of the party were behind her, and the sounds of it were muffled by distance, and the dark land was around her on all sides. She stopped at the paddock fence. She put her hands on the rail and she stood there and let herself shake, because she'd held very still for the last 3 hours, and her body needed to do something with all of it, and this was what it chose. Not crying. She didn't cry. Or not yet. Not tonight. Just shaking, the way a thing does when the pressure inside it finally equals the pressure outside. She heard footsteps in the gravel. She knew them. Luke came to stand beside her at the fence and said nothing for a long time. She hadn't looked at him. She knew he was there by the sound and the warmth and the specific gravity of him, all of which she'd learned over a summer without meaning to learn them. "You heard," she said. "Cody heard. Then everyone heard." A pause. "Are you all right?" She gripped the fence rail. "I'm shaking." "I can see that." "That doesn't mean I made the wrong decision." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She turned to look at him. In the dark he was steady, in the way he always was. Not unmoved. She could see he wasn't unmoved, but stable. A person who has learned to carry feeling without being capsized by it. "The loan," she said. "The rate is going to convert. This is going to cost my father—" "That's tomorrow's problem," he said. Not dismissively, practically. "Tonight you did what needed doing. The rest is arithmetic. Arithmetic can be solved." She looked at him. "Can it?" she asked. He looked back at her with the evenness of someone who doesn't say things they don't believe. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I know you're someone who can work a problem. And I know I'm someone who can work a problem. And I don't think either of those things changes because the problem got harder. She held that. Behind her, the house was doing whatever it was doing. She heard a door, and voices at a volume that sounded like dispersal rather than continuation. And somewhere in it the sound of Grant Halston's particular register saying something she couldn't make out. It didn't feel like her concern. She'd felt her life in that party for months, compressed and managed, and now she was standing at a paddock fence in the August dark, and the life in the party had nothing to do with her anymore. "I'm going to have to face my father," she said. "Yes." "He's going to be—" "Yes," Luke said. "He will be." She exhaled. "I hate that this hurts him." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "That's how you know you actually love him. People who don't care don't hurt over it." She looked at the field, the dark pasture, the distant ridge, the August sky above it all thick with stars. "My grandfather planted the cottonwood trees on the south end," she said, out of nowhere, or not out of nowhere. It was connected to something she'd been thinking about that didn't quite have words yet. "My grandmother said he planted them because nothing else on this land was going to last long enough. Cottonwoods outlive everything." Luke was quiet, listening. "They're still there," she said. "4 of them. They're the oldest thing on this property." "I know," he said. "I ate my lunch under one of them in April." She looked at him. Something in her chest that had been compressed for months moved in a direction that felt like up. Not joy exactly. It was too raw an evening for joy. But something that was in the same direction as joy, pointing the same way. She turned back to the field. "Don't quit," she said. "Your contract. Don't let him use tonight as a reason." "I wasn't planning to." "He might try." "He might." A pause. "But I don't quit because things get uncomfortable. You know that about me by now." She did know that. She knew it the way she knew the location of the post driver Bobby Hale hid behind the fuel tanks, from paying attention, from the accumulation of ordinary days. "I have no idea what I'm walking back into," she said. "I know." "I'm going to have to go back in there." "You're going to have to go back in there," he agreed, not pushing her, just stating it as the fact they both knew it was. She stood for another moment at the fence. She looked at the land. Then she straightened up and took a breath and turned from the paddock. "Okay," she said. He nodded. She walked back toward the house. The party had thinned. Grant's car was already gone. She registered that with something that was mainly relief and a thin undercurrent of guilt. She would examine later, in private. The Carvers were leaving as she came through the front door, and Margaret Carver looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be disapproval and kept slipping into something more complicated. Evelyn thanked her for coming. Margaret made a sound and went. Davis Halston was still there, inexplicably, in the sitting room, with a drink. He looked at Evelyn when she came in with the expression of a man who doesn't know what side of a situation to be on, and has chosen alcohol as a neutral position. "That was something," he said. "It was," she said. "Grant left." "I saw." He swirled his drink. "You know, for what it's worth, I always thought—" He stopped. "Never mind what I always thought." "What did you always think?" He looked at his drink. "That he was marrying a ranch more than a person." A pause. "He'd have been good to you. He'd have been good at being good to you. There's a difference." He finished his drink. "Probably shouldn't have said that." "Probably," she agreed. "Thank you for saying it anyway." He left shortly after, and the caterers were packing up, and the house was getting its regular self back in increments, furniture returning to its positions, the strange, borrowed formality of the evening peeling away. Martha appeared from the kitchen with a look that communicated she had opinions and had decided to save them. She handed Evelyn a cup of tea. "Your father's in his office," she said. "I know." "He's been in there 20 minutes. "I'll go in a little while." Martha nodded. She went back to the kitchen. The tea was strong and too hot, and exactly right. Evelyn sat on the bottom stair and drank it. She thought about what was coming. The conversation with her father would be hard, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Silas Whitmore didn't lose arrangements quietly. He would be angry, and then he would be worried, and somewhere under both of those he would be hurt in the particular way of a man who did not fully understand why he was hurt, which was often the most difficult kind of hurt to sit with. She was going to tell him the truth. She was going to tell him about the loan terms, and what she'd found in the ledger, and what she was capable of, and what she intended to do going forward. She was going to say it all calmly and clearly and without anger, and he was going to push back, and it was going to take more than one conversation. But she was going to have the conversation, and she was going to have it honestly, and she was not going to pretend to be less than she was to make it easier for him. She finished the tea and set down the cup and stood up. Silas was at his desk with the lamp on and no papers in front of him, which meant he wasn't working. He was just in the room that felt most like himself when he didn't know what to do with himself. He looked at her when she came in. His face was still doing the complicated thing it had started in the party. The old, unguarded look, the one she'd rarely seen. She sat down across from him, not in the visitor's chair. She pulled it around slightly, angling toward him rather than opposite him. A small thing. He noticed it. "Start with whatever you need to start with," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Do you understand what tonight cost this family?" "Yes," she said. "The loan, the rate converts, I know. I've done the arithmetic." She held his gaze. "I've also identified 3 operational cost reductions that can begin this fall. The grazing correction alone saves 18% on supplemental feed. There are 2 others." He blinked. "The ranch is not going to collapse," she said. "It's going to be hard for a season, possibly 2. We've had hard seasons. This is different." "Yes," she said. "It is. But we're not finished, Dad. Not if we're smart about it." She leaned forward slightly. "I've been managing operations for 4 years. Not informally. Actually, the numbers I've been running are better than Bobby's, and we both know it, even if we haven't said it." She watched his face. "Let me do it formally. Let me do what I've already been doing, with the authority that goes with it. We don't need Grant Halston's bank rate. We need to run this ranch the way it should be run." The office was quiet. Silas looked at the ledger she'd corrected, which was still on the corner of his desk where he'd left it from the morning. "The northern herd shift," he said slowly, "saves another month of recovery time on the south pasture. Luke Mercer's observation, which I verified. It holds." At the name, something moved across Silas's face. Not anger exactly. Something more complicated than anger. "Mercer," he said. He's good at his work," she said. "And he's honest. And he doesn't take shortcuts. And those are harder to find than a favorable loan rate." Her father looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze and didn't fill the silence, because she'd learned, from Luke, she supposed, though she'd say she'd been practicing it her whole life, that silence was not always something that needed to be fixed. "I thought I was protecting this place," he said finally. The words came out flatter than she expected, stripped of their defense. "I thought Grant had the capital, the connections. I thought it was the right decision." "I know," she said. "I know you thought that. I didn't ask you." "No," she said. "You didn't." He absorbed that. "I'm asking now," he said. It cost him something. She could see it. "What do you need to keep this ranch?" She looked at her father, at the tired, complicated, stubborn, imperfect man who had raised her with one hand and held her back with the other, who loved this land as deeply as she did, and had never quite figured out that he'd raised someone capable of loving it just as much. And she felt the full complicated truth of him, and she didn't try to simplify it. "I need you to trust me," she said. "Not because I'm asking nicely, because I've earned it. You've seen the ledger. You know what I've been doing." She paused. "Trust me the way you'd trust a son." His jaw moved. He looked at the desk. "And Mercer?" he said. "Luke stays through the expansion. After that, we assess the same way we assess anyone, on what he brings to the work." Silas was quiet for a long time. "This is going to be a hard year," he said. "I know. People in this county are going to talk." "They're already talking," she said. "I'm less concerned about that than about the winter feed budget." He looked at her, and then slowly something in his face rearranged. Not resolution exactly, and not yet peace, but the beginning of a man arriving somewhere he wasn't expecting to arrive. "You're so much like your mother," he said. Very quiet. She wasn't sure if he meant it as a compliment. She decided to take it as one. "Tell me about the other 2 cost reductions," he said. She told him. They sat in his office until almost midnight, the lamp between them, the ledger open on the desk, going through the numbers together for the first time. Not Silas managing and Evelyn watching, but 2 people who both understood what they were looking at, working through what needed to be done. It was not easy. He pushed back on two of her projections and was right about one of them and wrong about the other, and they argued it out without pretense, and she revised what needed revising and held what needed holding. When she finally stood to go, her father sat with his reading glasses in his hands and looked older than she'd been letting herself see. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too." He paused. "Evelyn." She stopped. "The correction in the 2019 logs," he said. "I should have been the one reading those." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She turned off the light she'd turned on when she came in, leaving him his lamp, and she went down the hall to her room. She sat on her bed in the quiet dark for a while, not thinking exactly, just existing inside the magnitude of what the day had been. The morning, the party, the fence, the office, the shaking at the paddock rail, her father's face. She thought about the cottonwood trees on the south end. She thought about tomorrow. There was so much to do. Calls to make, budgets to revise, a foreman to have a frank conversation with, a county full of people whose opinions she would have to outlast through sheer performance of competence. The rate conversion meant the next 12 months would require the kind of careful, grinding, unglamorous work that didn't look impressive from the outside, but was the only thing that had ever actually kept a land operation alive. She was not afraid of that work. She was, in fact, the only person on this ranch who had been doing most of it already. She lay back and looked at the ceiling and thought, very briefly, just for a moment, about Luke Mercer eating his lunch under a cottonwood tree in April, before she'd known him well enough to know what that image would one day mean to her. Then she closed her eyes, and her body, which had been waiting for permission, gave way to the exhaustion of the day, and she slept. The first week after the engagement celebration was the quietest the Whitmore Ranch had been in years. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind. The quiet that settles over a place after something loud has happened, when everyone is still sorting out what the noise meant. The county talked, as Silas had predicted. Word moved through the kind of communities where word always moves fast, carried by people who weren't there and sharpened in the retelling. By Monday, 3 different versions of Saturday night existed in circulation, none of them entirely accurate, all of them containing the essential true thing. Evelyn Whitmore had walked away from Grant Halston in front of everyone who mattered in that part of the county. Evelyn went to work Monday morning the same way she'd gone to work every morning for 4 years. She fed the horses. She checked the water lines. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and the calculator and the cold coffee, and she made the calls that needed making. The first call was to the bank. Not Grant's bank, but the regional agricultural lender she'd been quietly researching since May. The one with a ranch-specific loan program that Bobby Hale had mentioned offhandedly in March, and then forgotten. She'd written the number in the margin of her personal notebook, the way she wrote everything she intended to come back to. The loan officer was a woman named Sandra Reeves, who had been working agricultural finance for 22 years, and who spoke with the clipped, specific efficiency of someone who had heard every version of ranch financial distress and knew exactly which questions to ask. Evelyn answered them all directly. Sandra Reeves did not make her feel managed. She made her feel assessed, which was different and considerably more respectful. "Send me the last 3 years of operational records," Sandra said. "The actual ones, not the summary Bobby Hale sends." Evelyn paused. "You know Bobby Hale?" "I know every Bobby Hale in this region," Sandra said dryly. "Send me what you've been keeping." She sent them that afternoon. Dub. Silas did not make the transition easy. She hadn't expected him to. He went through a period of roughly 2 weeks that she would later describe, privately, as him grieving, not Grant Halston specifically, because she didn't think he'd been especially attached to Grant as a person, but the arrangement, the certainty. The version of the future he'd built in his mind and settled into the way an older man settles into a chair, carefully, because the joints don't trust new furniture the way they used to. He questioned her decisions twice in the first week. Once about the feed order she'd reduced by 18%, which he thought was too aggressive. Once about the decision to move the northern herd early, which he thought was premature. She had the numbers to support both, and she showed them to him without emotion, spread across the kitchen table, and she answered his questions and held her positions on the ones where her data was solid and revised her position on one minor point where he was right. The revision on the hay storage schedule, which his practical read of the storage space was more accurate on than her projection. She showed him she could do that. that she wasn't managing him out of the decisions, just making better ones. It took 2 weeks before he stopped questioning each one individually. It took another 2 before he started asking her what she thought before he'd formed his own position, which was a thing that had never happened in her life, and which she received without making anything of it, because making something of it would have made it harder for him to keep doing. Grant did not call. She had expected he might, not to reconcile, she was clear-eyed about that, but to address the loan situation, to posture, to do any of the various things that men like Grant did when the terms of their arrangements changed without warning. He didn't. She heard through Sandra Reeves 6 weeks later that the loan had been formally restructured with no involvement from Halston Financial, at a rate that was not as favorable as the original terms, but it was manageable given the operational savings she'd already implemented. She signed the new loan documents herself, which was the first time her name had appeared on a Whitmore Ranch financial document without her father's signature also on it. She looked at her signature on the page for a moment, then she filed it and went back to work. Luke stayed through the West expansion, which ran into October as contracted. He worked the boundary line with the same methodical competence he'd brought to everything since March, and the fence went up solid and plumb and would last significantly longer than the previous version because he didn't cut corners on post depth, even when the ground was hard and cutting corners would have been faster. The dynamic between them shifted after the party, but not in the way she'd been half braced for. It didn't become charged or difficult or strange in the way that things between people become when large events intervene. It became more direct, less careful around the edges. He asked her 3 weeks after the party what the rate on the new loan was. She told him. He did the math in his head in about 4 seconds and said, "That's workable if the grazing correction holds through February." And she said, "That's what I think too." And then they were talking about the February projections, as if nothing about the ground between them had changed, except that some of the underbrush had been cleared. What had changed, she realized, was that they were no longer navigating around the engagement. They'd both been doing it without acknowledging it, holding a perimeter around a fact that neither of them had felt it was their place to address directly. With the fact removed, there was simply more room to stand in. He told her, in late September, that his contract end date was October 15th and that he'd had an inquiry from a ranch 2 counties over that wanted him for a winter position. She was checking the south water line when he told her. She kept checking the water line. "Is it good work?" she asked. "Decent," he said. "Cattle operation. Smaller than this." She straightened up and looked at him. He was watching her with the steady openness he had when he wasn't performing anything. "What do you want to do?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to stay," he said. "If there's a position that makes sense. Not for the same reasons I came, for different reasons." She held his gaze. "The ranch can support a second foreman position. I've needed one and been doing both jobs myself." She paused. "The pay would be fair, the work would be significant, and I don't manage the way Bobby manages." "No," he said. "You don't." "What are the different reasons?" she asked. She needed to hear it directly. She'd learned over a summer of him that directness was the right language between them and the only one she fully trusted. He looked at the water line for a moment, then at her. "I think you know," he said. "I'd like you to say it." He nodded, like a man who'd been expecting this and had accepted it. "I'd like to be somewhere you are," he said. Simple. No performance, no embellishment. The words in their plainest form, which was the most weight they could carry. "That's the primary reason. The rest of it, the work, the land, that's real and it matters. But that's the primary reason." She stood in the south pasture in the October light, with the smell of turning grass around her, and a man she had spent 8 months learning looking at her without pretense. And she thought about everything that had happened since a spring dinner when a fork stopped moving and a crack started running. "You should know," she said, "that this ranch is going through its hardest year in 2 decades. The loan is manageable, but it requires everything I have. I don't have a lot of extra right now. I'm running at capacity almost all the time." "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you for extra. I'm asking to be part of what's already happening." She looked at him. "October 15th, she said. "At the end of your contract, we can talk about terms." He nodded. Not disappointed. He'd expected a practical answer, and she'd given him one, and he respected it. "All right." She went back to the water line. She was smiling, slightly, when her back was turned, and she let herself do it for exactly the moment it was true. And then she went back to work. The winter was as hard as she'd said it would be. The rate conversion meant that December and January required the kind of spending discipline that touches every area. Fewer seasonal hires, harder choices about equipment repairs versus replacements. One month where the numbers were tight enough that she sat at the kitchen table at 11 at night, going over them a third time, not because she didn't trust her arithmetic, but because she needed to be sure. Luke found her there on one of those nights, coming in late from checking a heifer who'd been showing early signs of distress. He looked at the table and he looked at her face and he said, "How bad?" "Not catastrophic," she said. "Just close." "How close?" She showed him the column. He sat down across from her, which he'd started doing over the fall, without either of them marking the moment it became normal, and he looked at the numbers with the expression of someone who has been in tight margins before and knows the specific texture of manageable versus genuinely dangerous. "The hay reserve," he said. "You've got more than you need through March if the winter breaks early, which it looks like it will." He pointed. "And this line, the equipment reserve, you set it at 10% of value, but the tractor ran clean all fall. You could pull 2% back temporarily." She looked at the line. She'd been conservative on the equipment reserve because she always was. "That covers the gap," she said, "with about 400 left over." She sat back. The kitchen was quiet and warm, and outside the winter was doing its work without any interest in what was happening at the table. "$400 is not a comfortable margin," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's a margin." She looked at the numbers for a while longer. Then she closed the ledger. "My grandfather built this ranch with less," she said. Not as inspiration, just as a fact she was placing next to the current fact to see how they fit. "Probably," Luke said. He stood and went to pour himself water from the tap, and when he came back he set a glass in front of her too, which was the kind of small thing he did without announcing it. "Get some sleep, the numbers will be the same in the morning." "That's not comforting." "It's not supposed to be comforting. It's supposed to be true." She picked up the water glass. "You're not a very soothing person." "No," he said simply. "But you're not someone who needs soothing. You need accurate information and enough sleep to use it." He looked at her directly. "Go to sleep, Evelyn." It was the first time in all of it that he'd used her first name without the miss in front of it. She noticed. She didn't say anything. She finished her water and went to bed. February broke early, as he'd thought it would. The south pasture came through the winter with better recovery than she'd projected. The grazing rotation correction was holding, and the extended rest period had done what she'd calculated it would do, which was give the grass time to establish root depth that would carry through a dry summer. The hay reserve came in 2 weeks ahead of depletion. The equipment held. In March, almost exactly 1 year after Luke Mercer had first walked onto the Whitmore property with a coil of fence wire and an unassuming manner, the ranch turned its first positive month since the rate conversion. She showed Silas the March numbers over breakfast. He looked at them for a long time. "The feed cost reduction," he said. "Rotation correction. Held all winter." He turned the page. "The water system. This capital expense." Luke rerouted the secondary intake line in January. Took him 3 days. Saves approximately 9% on pump operation annually. He looked up. "You didn't tell me about that." "I'm telling you now," she said. "In the monthly report." He sat with that. The shift it represented. The fact that his daughter was running his ranch and reporting to him rather than asking permission, and that the numbers on the table were better than they'd been before the engagement and the loan conversion and all the wreckage of last August. He sat with it in the specific way of a man who has been forced to update a belief he'd been holding a long time, which is never comfortable but is sometimes the most important thing a person does. "Luke Mercer," he said. "Luke Mercer," she agreed. A pause. "He's a good man," Silas said. He said it the same way he'd said it about Grant Halston, months ago, but differently. The previous time had been a man convincing himself. This time it was a man stating something he'd arrived at through observation, which sat in the air without any of the hollow quality of the first version. "Yes," she said. "He is." Her father looked at the March numbers again. He didn't say anything else. But he reached for his reading glasses and put them on and went through the report in the careful, attending way he'd gone through the loan documents years ago, when things on this ranch still required his full reading, and she understood that as its own statement. She and Luke married in late April, under the 4 cottonwood trees on the south end of the property. It was not a large wedding, that was deliberate. She'd spent enough of the previous year inside someone else's version of an event about her life that she had very clear ideas about how this one should go. Small, practical, outside, with people she actually knew. Cody was there, cleaned up and earnest, with the particular emotion of a young man at the wedding of 2 people he respected. Bobby Hale came in the suit he only wore to funerals and weddings and sat in the second row and blew his nose loudly at an inopportune moment. Martha had made the food herself, which she'd insisted on with a firmness that allowed no debate. Sandra Reeves came, which surprised Evelyn until she thought about it and realized it didn't. Silas walked Evelyn to the cottonwood trees with his arm through hers and the old, weathered look on his face of a man who is holding several feelings at once and not sure which one is in charge. He was wearing the suit he'd worn to Evelyn's mother's funeral, which was the nicest thing he owned, and which he'd had cleaned for this. When they got to the end of the aisle, which was just the grass between the chairs and the trees, not an aisle at all, he stopped. He looked at Luke. Luke looked back at him with the even, undefended quality that was simply how Luke faced things. Silas put out his hand. Luke shook it, not as a formality, as one man acknowledging another, with the weight of everything that had happened between them, which was considerable, and the understanding that they were going to have to build something from here, which was also considerable. "Take care of her," Silas said. Luke said, "She takes care of herself. I plan to be worth standing next to." Silas's jaw worked. He nodded. He let go of Luke's hand and stepped back and sat in the front row and looked at the cottonwood trees above their heads. And something in the set of his shoulders shifted into something she hadn't seen in a long time, something that was less defended than his usual bearing. She noticed. The ceremony was short and honest. They said the words they meant and didn't perform the words they didn't. When it was over and Luke kissed her, Cody made a noise that was supposed to be a cheer and came out more like a yelp. And Bobby Hale blew his nose again, and Martha started moving food from the kitchen to the tables with the brisk satisfaction of someone whose contribution to a day is about to be appreciated at scale. Evelyn stood under the cottonwood trees with her husband and looked at the land around her. The south pasture greening up in the April light, the fence line along the west boundary that Luke had built post by post through the summer heat, the distant ridge, the buildings, the whole complicated, beloved working thing of it. And she felt it the way she felt it on her best mornings, like something she was genuinely part of, not just living inside. "Your grandfather picked good trees," Luke said, looking up. "He picked things that would last," she said. "He didn't always know why, according to my grandmother. He just knew that some things you plant for the people who come after you." Luke looked at her. The April light was on his face, and he looked, not younger, not easier, but exactly himself, with all the history of him still in his hands and his eyes and the careful way he held things he didn't want to drop. She didn't want him without any of that. She'd never been drawn to the easy version. "Then we should plant something," he said. She looked at him. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. He considered it. "Something that lasts," he said. "I'm not particular about the species." In the years that followed, the Whitmore Ranch became something it had never quite been before. Not larger, not flashier, but coherent. The kind of operation that makes sense all the way through, where the decisions in the ledger match the decisions in the field, and the people doing the work are the same people making the plans. Evelyn ran operations with the full formal authority she'd been exercising informally for years, and the difference that authority made was not in what she did, but in how the work could be built, on record, on purpose, with her name on the decisions where it belonged. She hired carefully and kept people long. She lost Bobby Hale to retirement the following spring and replaced him with a younger woman named Terry, who had grown up on a sheep operation in the next county and read water tables the way other people read weather, and the two of them developed a working relationship that was occasionally contentious and consistently productive. Luke became what the ranch needed him to be, which was not a title but a function. The person who went to the place where the problem actually was, not the place where the report said the problem was, and who could tell the difference between a situation requiring patience and one requiring immediate action, which turns out to be a rarer skill than it sounds. He trained Cody well enough that Cody eventually left for his own operation, which Luke said was the best outcome, meaning he'd done his job. They had 2 daughters. The first, born the year after the wedding, was named Clara after Evelyn's mother. The second, 3 years later, was called May because she'd been born in May, and they'd been too tired and too happy to think of anything more complicated than the month itself. Silas, who had never been easy with softness, turned out to be considerably better at being a grandfather than he'd ever been at being a father. Something in the removal of the stakes, the freedom from the particular weight of raising someone, let him be present in a way he hadn't managed with Evelyn, and she watched it happen without bitterness, because bitterness would have cost her something she didn't want to pay, and because her daughters deserved the best version of him that existed, whatever that required of her. He came to the ranch every Tuesday for dinner until he was too old to drive, and then they went to him. Those Tuesday dinners were rarely comfortable in the easy sense. Silas and Evelyn still argued about ranch decisions with the energy of 2 people who both knew what they were talking about and had different instincts about risk. But they were real. Evelyn had decided, somewhere in the hard first winter, that she'd rather have real than comfortable, and she'd built her life accordingly. One evening, years in, when the girls were old enough to help with the evening feed and young enough to still compete over who got to do which task, Evelyn found her father sitting alone on the south porch, looking at the cottonwood trees in the late light. He was in his 80s by then. The ranch had been through 3 more hard years and 4 good ones, and the hard ones had been survivable because of decisions made during the good ones, and the decisions during the good ones had been made by people who understood the land rather than people who understood capital, and the difference had compounded over time into something Silas Whitmore was sitting on his porch looking at. Evelyn sat down beside him. He didn't say anything for a while. The cottonwoods moved in the evening wind. From the barn, she could hear Clara giving May instructions about water pressure with the specific authority of an older sister who has recently learned something and is not yet over it. "I made a mistake," her father said. She looked at him. "The dinner," he said. "That night. The announcement." He was looking at the trees, not at her. "I made a mistake." She was quiet for a moment. "You thought you were protecting this," she said. "I know what I thought." He moved his hand slightly, a gesture that dismissed the excuse before she could offer it to him. "I treated you like an asset, a piece of this land to be arranged." He paused. "You were never that." The evening was warm and the light was the kind that makes everything look considered, and she sat with her father in it and felt the long, complicated shape of being his daughter, all the years of it, the managed and the discovered and the corrected and the rebuilt. "I know you love this place," she said. "I know you love it more," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her, finally, directly, with the eyes of an old man who has been working on something for years and isn't sure he's finished but wants to say what he's arrived at while there's still time to say it. "You kept it," he said. "When I would have sold it to the wrong future, you kept it." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would improve on what he'd just said, and she'd learned from many sources, but perhaps most thoroughly from the man she'd married, that some things deserve to be received rather than responded to. She put her hand over her father's on the armrest of the porch chair. They sat there until the light was gone, and Luke came out to say the girls had finished with the horses and dinner was on, and Silas stood up slowly and Evelyn stood beside him, and they walked into the lit house together. The last thing, the thing she thought about sometimes when the ranch was quiet, and she had a moment that was fully hers, was not the engagement party or the loan documents, or even the first morning with Luke in the south pasture. It was a much smaller thing. It was the night of the original dinner, the announcement, when she'd sat at her father's table and understood that her life was being arranged without her, and she'd felt the first crack running through something she'd been holding together through sheer, habitual effort. She thought about what it means to be seen, not admired, not wanted, not arranged, seen. The specific act of another person looking at you and registering what's actually there rather than what they need to be there. She thought about how rare it was, and how you never noticed how rare it was until it happened, and then you wondered how you'd gone so long without it. She thought about a man who had refused to congratulate her surrender, not because he had a plan or an agenda, but because he had a standard, quietly held, about what deserved celebrating and what did not. That was the beginning of everything. Not the party, not the choice, Not the lease and the loan and the long, hard winter. Just that. A single act of refusal that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with who he was. She hadn't known him yet. He hadn't known her. But integrity doesn't require an audience, and it doesn't require that the right person is watching. It just requires that you hold it anyway. She had learned that from him, and she had tried to give it back to him by holding her own. And somewhere in that exchange, the slow, imperfect, working accumulation of two people choosing what they stood for, a life had been made. Not a perfect life. Not without cost. Not without the seasons that nearly broke the math, and the conversations that left someone raw at the end, and the ordinary daily weight of running something real in the real world, with real people who made real mistakes, herself included. But hers. Fully, finally, irreversibly hers. Under the cottonwood trees her grandfather had planted for people he wouldn't live to meet, the Whitmore Ranch continued its work. The grass grew back, the fences held, the water ran clear through the corrected lines. And every morning, before the house woke, Evelyn Whitmore pulled on her boots and walked out into whatever the day was going to be. Not because it was easy, and not because it was certain, but because it was hers to walk into, and she had never once, not in all of it, been willing to let someone else walk it for her. That was the whole of it. That was enough.